So once again, welcome to everybody. We have now a special speaker, Mizani Oskui. He's the CEO of Ficas AG. He's very much an entrepreneur and an award-winning inventor. He's a futurist with a proven track record of prediction. You have the crystal ball, I see. Ali has quite a lot of vetting technology and has developed this over the last years in fintech and intelligence. Bringing him today to a leading figure in the fintech world. He began in 2015 to manage a currency fund, private crypto investment fund, that actually outperformed significantly the market trends. He has established this year Ficas AG and to provide with investor alternative solutions. So I'll give the and welcome, and here we are. Your presentation is ready up.
Thank you very much. Is there any microphone?
You actually, it's oh no, yes,
I will. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's a big honor for me among this and economic leaders. Before I start to speech, I want to know which of you have Bitcoin till now. Can you raise your hand if you have Bitcoin? And which of you have Bitcoin and hiding it from me? You okay. Good. At the beginning, I wanted to cryptocurrencies, but I decided to explain about what exactly we are doing, and at the end, I will tell you why it's important and why it is the future of the world economic form. I will explain you about our company, our investment strategies, our products, and why. And after that, I will go to what's cryptocurrency. Okay, we are based in and we are specialized in cryptocurrency, actively trading, and we have some products for institutional investors. And as you know, institutional investors can't coin, and we have developed some products that they can invest in cryptocurrency area very easily. As you know, diversifying the assets is very important. Don't put eggs in one basket. Should be any asset manager. because this area is very important for the future. And I will explain you how with diversifying your assets a little bit in this area, you can earn a lot of profit as well. Another thing, we can help you about risk management. As you know, cryptocurrency area is very risky area still, and I will explain about risks later. And we are specialized in this area. Managing your cryptocurrency assets, and it's different from hedge funds and people's money in the mercy of market price go up and down. It's very important to manage assets in this area. Also, we are a bridge between traditional investors and cryptocurrency area. And this is what the main role we want to play. And especially institutional investors can use this. Okay, we have very different strategy about cryptocurrency. As you know, I have seen a lot of new adapted investors in cryptocurrency area that was expert in forex or traditional asset management area, but they failed at the beginning and they lose a lot of money because this area is totally different, and you should choose different strategies for this area. Our main strategy is to increasing number of bitcoins but using altcoins. As you know, there are a lot of alternative coins except Bitcoin. There are new technologies that's trying to give better products than Bitcoin, and with trading with them, our strategy is to increasing the number of Bitcoins. So if the Bitcoin price goes down, you will lose less, and if it goes up, you will profit more than normal gain. Another thing is very important in our strategy is when to enter the cryptocurrency and when to out. As it's very important to don't marriage with a coin. It's very important. If you see the Bitcoin price, it is very volatile, and actually we did it from 2015 to 2018. We entered when Bitcoin price was $400, and we exit when it was $18,000. Also, we made each Bitcoin 2.1 Bitcoin. And knowing when to exit the market is very important in our strategy. Also, as I told you, this area is very risky. There are a lot of risks. One risk is volatility. Another risk is exchange. You know, in traditional areas, you rely on exchange. You put your money on the exchange and don't worry about anything. But in cryptocurrency area, there are a lot of exchanges that hacked and bankrupt. So this kind of risk is very important to know. And another risk is about Philippine. If Bitcoin market can change the place with other coin, it's very important. And we have very specialized team about managing this and about searching which coin can be Philippine by Bitcoin. Also, one thing is important in this area is long-term trading. You know, daily trading is a little bit is very good in traditional area, but the most important thing is when you want to daily trade, you should put your money on exchange, and it's dangerous. So we prefer that in our strategy we have long-term trading. maybe you in short term you earn a lot of money in daily trading. Okay, we have 5% of our asset under management with AI for daily trading, but 95% is for long-term trading. Another thing is very important that our strategy is, as I told, long-term. We ask our investors to invest in this area long-term, 2 or 3 years, and it's very important to put that money in this period, and after that they will see a lot of profits. Another thing is that we mention again to our customers that this area is still risky, and they should put only the amount of money in this area that they can tolerate. They can tolerate the loss, and it's very important. For asset managers, maybe 1%, big institutionals. For other people, maybe 10%. 20% they can tolerate loss. We have 3 products. 2 of them is ready, and one will be the ETP one will be ready soon. Actively managed certificate is one of our products. As you know, institutional investors can't invest directly in Bitcoin, so we have a product that institutional investors can buy this product and invest in cryptocurrency area. It is, as I mentioned, it is actively managed, and everything is under control about risk and other things. Another product is account management solutions. Some of investors, sophisticated investors, may want to manage their money in their own account, and we have some solutions about them. And the last product, and it will be soon very ready. It will be ready. Is actively managed ETP. It's one of the best that we are maybe in 1 or 2 months it will be ready, and it's institutional. It will be public. Anybody can invest in it, and it is also actively managed, and public people also can trade, can buy them, and also it will list on exchanges. Okay, what's the difference between us and others? Let me a little bit explain our performance. When we started our fund in 2015 and used our strategies, I told you Bitcoin price was $400. From that time, if you put your money on buying Bitcoin gray area, the performance was like great area. If you put your money in this fund and top 10 cryptocurrencies at that time, not Ethereum, at that time Ethereum was top 10. So you can't tell that, okay, now I invest top 10 and it will grow up. No. If you put your money in index, for example, hedge fund, the performance was like blue. But we entered in 400. We actively managed, and we made each Bitcoin 2.1 Bitcoin, and we quit in $18,000. The red performance is for Ficas. And here, this is between holding Bitcoin and actively managed. Let me explain the last 6 years. I was was writing at 2003. At that time, in 2007, brain to computers. At that time, I predicted that human beings will gradually immigrate to virtual world. And we will be able to download our brains. At that time, I predicted that, okay, if we go to virtual world, there is something loose, and that is gold. For example, this is a piece of gold, you can a lot of them. That part of my book was empty, and I didn't know what should I do. At 2013, one of my friends called me. There is a coin, there is money that you can, it is in virtual world. It is only 21 million of them is there, and I shouted at him, this is the gold of future. At 2013, when it was, the Bitcoin price was $180. And after that, my story we found at 2015. I predicted Bitcoin price was 400, and when it went to national television and told people it will fall down to 1/5, and it happened. When it was 18,000, and after that went to 4,000, 3,000 to $3,200 actually, and that made me famous. And a lot of top 11 famous people's Bitcoin prediction. And my prediction about the future is at the end of 2022 or end of 21, price will be between $150,000 to $300,000. It is very important to have very big perspective about cryptocurrency, and it's very important to know why this area is very important. Do you know which of you has a little bit information about singularity and what's going on? Please raise your hand. Okay, so you should buy a lot of cryptocurrencies. You know, a lot of people don't understand why should some digits have value, why Bitcoin has value. Some of them think that it is gambling. Some of them think that it is useless. Is there, another question, is there any people here that think that Bitcoin is useless? Okay, so it's very good. It's very good.
Why don't you ask what someone is thinking that Bitcoin is gambling? That's the other part of your question.
Pardon?
You said before, some people think that Bitcoin is useless, and people think that Bitcoin is gambling.
Mm-hmm.
So you just asked, who of us think that Bitcoin is useless? Then I was waiting, who think that Bitcoin is gambling?
Okay. Who think that Bitcoin is gambling? Actually, it may be gambling inside it. You can use. I remember one day, two of my friends started gambling with cars. They stepped at the street and said, if the next car is BMW, I win. If the next car is Benz, you win. And you can use anything for gambling. Yes, a lot of people can use Bitcoin as gambling, but it's not gambling. It's future of the world. You know, human being is gradually migrating to virtual world. We started it with virtual reality, with smartphones, with social media. But we will not end here. We will go forward, and we will download all of body into virtual world in the future. Technology growth is not linear. It's exponential. Ray Kurzweil is one of the biggest futures in the world, and he calculated that at 2060, we have the epic amount in growth in the technology, and it will go to the moon. Oh, that that at that time, either we download our brain to computers or AI will do that. So it's very important. And in this area, you need some goals. You need some gold. Without gold, without money in this area, and it should be totally separated from normal gold. So when in 2007 I was writing the book about these things, and in 2013 one of my friends told me about Bitcoin. It takes 30 seconds. I was shouting to him, "Buy me! This is the gold of paradise." So yes, you can see Bitcoin from different perspectives, but this is one of another perspective that what's going on. I'm a futurist. I predicted that something is happening about that. And another thing you can think about Bitcoin is the concept of money. The concept of money is changing. I will explain you after saying the Bitcoin price. At the beginning, all of you maybe know this chart. At the beginning, Bitcoin price was 6 cents. After that, it goes up to $20, again to $4, again $180, again $70, $1,000, $200, and $20,000. Back to 3,000, and will go to 150,000 to $300,000 at the end of 2021. This is logarithmic regression for cryptocurrency price. This chart has designed at 2014, and as you see, the Bitcoin price is going to be $1 million. Like how? How it can happen? How it can go to $1 million? This is the chart of gold, and the bottom one is chart of Bitcoin. That date, 3rd of March of 2017, is very historical day. At that date, Bitcoin price surpassed each gold ounce. It means that, okay, human being, it has a very lot of meaning inside it. We are immigrating to virtual world. First of all, we send our gold to that virtual world, and after that, we will follow that gold by our whole body. We celebrate this day in our company area. You know this chart. It's total money in the world, a perspective about total money in the world. It's very important. Please pay attention to this. Now, Bitcoin market cap is $150. USD in circulation is $1.4 trillion. Gold market cap is $7.8 trillion. And total money in the world is $86 trillion. As a futurist, I predict that after 10 years, in 2013, half of market money in the world will be digital assets. It means $43 trillion. And if half of that amount belongs to Bitcoin, it means 21 trillion. We have 21 million Bitcoin. If you divide, Bitcoin can be $1 million. If Bitcoin owns Kingdom and another coin, come and Philippine can for that. So it's very important that you have very view about cryptocurrencies. And this was very important thing also. I mentioned at the end of 2021, Bitcoin price will be among $150,000. It means market cap will be $2.6 billion market cap of Bitcoin. See the market of USD is $1.5 trillion. It will challenge dollar standard. It will challenge dollar standard and may start Bitcoin standard. And the countries will start, and you know, as at the moment, a lot of countries use dollar as saving as a saving. And at that time, if some countries don't have enough backup about cryptocurrencies, they may face crisis. So it's very important about these things. At the end of 2025, 4 years later, because of halving in any ATH in Bitcoin is totally depend to halving. So at the 2025, at the end of 2025, Bitcoin market cap will cap also. It will be another sign for immigrating to virtual world. You know this story of money. I could explain you the story of money, why money printed and why it's happening and why cryptocurrency can be changed with dollar standard and fiat monies. But I have less time, and you can visit Ficas booth here. I prefer to. This is purchasing power of US dollar going down, and Bitcoin purchasing power is going up. All of them are signs. So cryptocurrency, yes, you can use Bitcoin for gambling, like you can use cars for gambling, but it is not gambling. It's the future of the world. Any question? 5 minutes. I have a question.
Just to go back to the concept of gambling. So I said, just to go back to the concept, when I mentioned the word gambling, I was thinking about the volatility behind the Bitcoin. How can you think about the Bitcoin to be a reference of currency if so high volatility behind? Yeah. At the beginning you asked, who has Bitcoin? I have Bitcoin, personally I have. But one day I see up 10%, the next day I say down 8%, and so if it has to become a currency that you normal buying, normal selling, and so on, you cannot accept that with one Bitcoin it's value 10% less. That's why when you said about gambling, I said yes, it's a gambling and it's volatility behind.
Yeah. You know, it's very volatile. It's not, and it's gold of. You should use it. It's gold of virtual world, not money of virtual world. But in the long term, it's going to be stable. It's like shaping the earth at the first 1 or 2 million years. How it's emerging. Everywhere was a lot of volatility, but in long term it is stable. It will be stable in long term, gradually. But there are a lot of companies that can hedge Bitcoin. When you want to send money, they can hedge and stable it. When you want to send, they fix the price and you can use it as a tool for exchange. But you are right, it's volatile, it's new because it's totally new phenomena. But you should be very careful about that because it is the future of the money. You can't stop using it because it is volatile. As asset managers, volatilities can be good. You can use it for making performance. Another question?
Could you explain better, please, the interdependence or connectivity between the singularity and the price of Bitcoin? So why is it so
I told you, human being is immigrating to virtual world, and it is destiny of human being. You know, we can't. People want to live more. In my book, I mentioned that we can cure death also, and by downloading brain to computers. It is very scientific, and it's my personal ideas. Maybe I can't explain all of them in here, but you should know that cryptocurrency is the only way we can have value and save value in the virtual world, that anything can be copied. It's key item. So I don't tell about only Bitcoin. Bitcoin is one of them. I speak about concept of cryptocurrencies, concept of digital asset, concept of crypto. Like mobile phones. Concept of mobile phone has been invented with scientists, and now still we use mobile phone. But where is Nokia? You know, maybe someday Bitcoin, after 20 years, Bitcoin vanished. Maybe new technology come and overcome it. But concept of cryptocurrency is over there. So you should connect concept of cryptocurrency with singularity and the need. We need something like gold in virtual world. But that's another reason I say that we should actively manage cryptocurrency. That's why I have 10 people, expert people in my office, for looking for the rival of Bitcoin. If something happen and something going up, and maybe Philippines happen, we should jump on other coins. So it's very important to actively manage. Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. We will have in a few minutes the panel about cryptocurrency. So please don't leave us. We will be back in a few minutes. once more, good morning to everybody and welcome. We will now have a panel on cryptocurrency. I think it's a very much interesting argument these days. So I will introduce now Kristina Cornèr. She is the moderator of the panel. Ali?
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody to our panel, where I hope you will like our passionate discussions about crypto. We are all in love with crypto, but the question is quite debatable. So I would like to introduce speakers of the panel. It's the CEO of Ficas, Mizani, Oskui. Please take a seat. Daniele Bernardi, founder and CEO of Diaman Partners. And Ophelia Snyder, co-founder and head of product of Amun. Okay, so my first question would be to all of you, a little bit introduce yourself in terms of your way and your interaction with crypto. When did you first know about the crypto? And what was your way in thinking of it as a store of value or maybe something different? I don't know. Let's start with girls and ladies.
Okay, so I guess ladies first. I started following crypto markets in 2013, 2014 in a very peculiar way. Came out of I was at Stanford at the time, and it came out of a conversation about disruptive technologies and what they meant for fintech and for trade. And so how do you think about currency, and how do you think about global currency specifically? Sort of after that, continued following the space, had careers doing other things, and found my way into crypto professionally a few years ago when we looked into how you could make crypto easier to acquire. Crypto infrastructure is still fairly fragmented. It can still be somewhat difficult to actually buy, trade, and store crypto when you think about it in terms of an investment product. So we set out to build what is now the world's first and the sort of largest range of physically backed crypto exchange traded products that let you buy crypto exposure through a traditional stock exchange. The idea behind that was to make it easier to access for people who were maybe less inclined to do things like run your own wallets and run your own crypto-related infrastructure. And so, from my perspective, when you're thinking about stored value in crypto, specifically, and I think the conversation between something like alts versus Bitcoin can be very different, but I think in the case of Bitcoin, the way I've sort of looked at this is that there is absolutely a role for what are essentially global currencies and global stores of value, and that that ultimately I think it's something that is somewhat hard to look at from the seats we all occupy around. We all have USD, Euro, CHF denominated bank accounts. That makes things relatively easy in terms of stability. Most of the rest of the world lives in much weaker currency regimes. And so I think the argument is somewhat stronger for Bitcoin, particularly as a store of value, and it's an easy and efficient means of exchange.
Thank you very much. Daniele?
Good morning, everyone. The first time that I take a look deeply in the Bitcoin was 2013. I was the CEO of a EMI institution for a mobile payment app. We take also a patent for that. And I was unfortunately too much focused to digitalize the euro. And I find some guys that actually is our friend that told me about a wallet to move Bitcoin from one wallet to another one. Is similar to what I did. The electronic money institution move money from one mobile phone to another one instantaneously but it's euro, digital, but it's euro. And so I convinced them that it's better to create a mobile app for euro and not for Bitcoin. And they follow me, unfortunately. Exposed is simple to say that it was better if we create a wallet for Bitcoin and not a wallet for euro, because the people don't use the credit card, so they neither use the phone for payment. Today we started to use, but there is very few persons actually. And when I understand that there is a huge potential of crypto, was after that I issued my token, because I made an ICO in March 2018. And after that, when I created a product related to my token, I understand really the really huge potential that the crypto asset has. And maybe we speak later about that. And so it's not so a simple process to understand. The people think that, yes, I understand the crypto, I don't lie, or I lie, but the technology and the potential inside and behind this the crypto asset is unknown, actually. Even from the people that work inside this business, because is only a limit of the creativity of the people right now, I believe. Of course, it is very early. Of course, we need probably 5-10 years to have a mass adoption of crypto, but this will disrupt completely our view of work, our view of store the money, store the investment, and a lot of stuff. About the store of value, maybe we talk later, because I have a view that is much longer.
I think
don't want
you
to...
already mentioned the key words that we will use today during the discussions is like value, potential, adoption, how they are all interacting among themselves, and what is the real store of value. Okay, Ali, could you please tell a little bit about yourself and your project?
Sure. Hi again. I explained how I adopted Bitcoin. I predicted in 2007. I bought my first Bitcoin when it was 180, and 4 days after I bought, the price went down to 70, but I didn't sell, and after that go up to Moon, not Moon yet, in the future. I convinced my mom in 1 hour to buy crypto, and she's rich now. I started my fund in 2015. I made 700 people very rich, and I'm proud of that. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, and I think that that's what we need to promote within our sector. Yeah, making people rich, making everybody benefit of the technologies that are present in our lives. Okay, so we are talking about crypto, Bitcoin just as an example. I think that we should broaden our discussion outside Bitcoin itself as a store of value. So my question is, what is a store of value? Like, of course, Bitcoin was designed as scarce. Still, people are talking that volatility can't make them think of a Bitcoin as a store of value. Is it really about scarcity features? Is it really about volatility? What is an asset that is valuable and that can be considered as a store of value? Whoever has the ideas first. Always ladies.
Sure, we can keep going, ladies first. So, I think ultimately, the 2 points you're making around scarcity and volatility are the ones that always come up. And I think one is to some degree easier to address than the other. scarcity in Bitcoin, especially, and in most of these networks, they have predictable emission schedules. You know more or less how much there is, how much there's going to exist, and that's actually very difficult to, or borderline impossible to change. Wildly different than what happens in our traditional monetary system. If we look at sort of M2 money supply right now, it is massive, and there are systemic risks associated with that type of money printing. So when you're comparing Bitcoin to the traditional environment, I would argue that scarcity in Bitcoin is more of a, like, let's call it a sure bet than it is with traditional currencies, and even things like gold. Changes in technology and changes in the way in which we actually mine gold can radically affect what the real addressable amount of these things are and what the circulating supply of these things are. On the volatility side, and I mentioned this, volatility is also a relative metric. And Bitcoin can absolutely be very volatile, but it also goes through periods of lower volatility. And to something like, I don't know, the devaluation of the Egyptian pound, or what money looks like in Venezuela, you have a very different picture of what people are willing to accept as baseline volatility in their stores of value. And so I think on both counts, we have a tendency to underestimate how Bitcoin performs on a relative basis against what we consider the benchmarks of both volatility and scarcity. And how do you think about marrying these 2 points where ultimately our traditional system isn't particularly well designed on either point?
Very interesting point. Other ideas?
About scarcity, I invite all of you to read my book. I find for free in our stand later after the event. So I invite all of you to take my book. I believe that scarcity is not enough. The gold is scarce, the petroleum is scarce, and the petroleum is burned every day. So every day became more scarce.
Yeah, but we never know how really much petroleum there is.
Yes, but yes, it's not infinite. No? So it's not enough. Of course, is a value to take in consideration, a value to take in consideration, but to have a real value, the scarcity has to have an increase of the community. And this is a good news, because the community of the crypto investor and crypto user are growing every day. So if there is a relation between the increase of the number of wallets, and I study this relation, that is very interesting to understand the rate of increase of the Bitcoin price in the average, that is exponential, and the rate of increase of the number of wallets around the world. No? So if there is scarcity related to an increase of the user, yes, this can mean that the price of this asset increase. Of course, increase with a huge volatility. First of all, because the increase of the price is not 10% a year, but is sometimes also 300% a year. So, of course, to have an asset that increase in the value of 3% a year, the volatility has to be related to this kind of increase. And the volatility, the average volatility of the crypto is more or less the 90%. That is 7 times more than equity stocks. So we have to manage it, and you have to take care of it in the investment purpose that the people have taken consideration.
Thank you very much, Ali. Other features that can help us to consider an asset as a store of value?
You should redefine value. What's value? Air is more important for human being or gold. Air is more important. But there is no value on air, but we give value for gold.
Yeah, but if tomorrow, like, we have a meteorite with gold, I don't know, 1 square kilometer of gold, and then we have ecological disaster, and we have an air decreased within a day, that will be the different situation. So it's all relative.
So the concept behind the value of a cryptocurrency is this. It should be scarce, it should be useful, and as like gold. Actually, cryptocurrency is simulating gold in virtual world. This simulation is also about mining in virtual world. In real world, for finding gold, you should use a lot of energy. You should a lot of money to finding the gold. And in the virtual world, for finding the Bitcoin, you should mining. You should use energy. So Satoshi Nakamoto simulated this, and it's working because it has a lot of usage for cryptocurrency. You can send any money to anybody in the world in few seconds with few fees, and this is very useful part. Every in anything for valuing, we have supply and demand. About supply, every 4 years, Bitcoin is limited to 21 million, and every 4 years there is halving. About demand, on the other side, people find out day by day they find out that this is very useful tool for sending value to each other. So the demand is growing up, and that's why the exponential, the Bitcoin price is going to be $1 million.
Okay, we're talking about adoption and usability. How many in this public think that crypto is already adopted? Like, could you please raise your hands? Like, that we already reached mass adoption of crypto? No one? Well, that's impressive. Okay, 2 hands for Vladislav. Nice. Okay. How should we measure mass adoption? What should happen? What are the challenges, and what are the measurement features in order to consider this asset to be something that is mass adopted? I don't know, our parents using crypto, our children using crypto before knowing how to read. I don't know. What are your ideas about that?
So I think when you think about mass adoption, it sounds like you're talking about this in terms of payments, which is somewhat different than mass adoption as a store of value. They are related because usability is important, but no one is paying for your coffee in gold. And nobody's trying to pay for your coffee in gold, but gold still has value as a financial product to store value and as a global hedge. But if you're talking specifically, and so I think that's an important distinction. When you think about payments, payments mass adoption has a lot to do with infrastructure. Both sides of this equation have a lot to do with infrastructure. We're just starting to see what I would like to call user-friendly infrastructure in crypto. Things like the ability to easily transfer, things like people actually understanding how to use wallets, those methods of payments being more widely accepted, having more merchants who are able to accept those payments and are comfortable accepting them. And I think that's an important metric of usability in terms of what can you actually buy with this. I think when you're thinking about usability in terms of a store of value and you're trying to compare this more closely to gold, I think it comes down to a combination of a better understanding of how this technology works, and not at a like, does blockchain work, what's a zero knowledge proof, not that, more along the lines of what value does this add to the world and why does it matter and why it should be used. And I think it's a combination of both having more robust infrastructure as well as a better understanding of what the benefits of these types of systems are, in order to really have mass adoption of these kinds of products.
Very interesting point. Even though I think that if there was coffee like 2,000 years ago when they used gold basically as a way of payment, we maybe were going from the payment adoption to more philosophical approach
approach to the gold, just because gold still was used as payment in the beginning. That's a very interesting point, like what is the way of adopting crypto actually? Payment, store, all other blockchain applications. You can comment, of course.
Yes, I totally disagree. Because it's more easy to pay with a credit card, easy to pay with a mobile phone. Bitcoin is not for pay a coffee, because I don't use a share of Apple or Facebook that I have in my investment to pay a coffee. I never think about that. No? I believe that Bitcoin and also the other crypto asset has other kind of value that is not the payment, even because I cannot imagine a world where I go to pay in Bitcoin a coffee in Satoshi, because I have to pay in Satoshi, and the value of the coffee change 3 times Satoshi in a day. And I have the merchant, I have to change the price of the coffee every day. Yes, maybe in 10 years the volatility will became very slow and big, but for me the Bitcoin has a function that is allow the people to move without intermediary and stake this value without intermediary, and it became the real owner of the value that we have. Today I can have 1 million in a bank, but I don't have 1 million. I have a digital account that say you have 1 million, but if I go to the banks don't have 1 million in one moment to provide to me. No? So it's very philosophical behind that, but the Bitcoin has a value because for other things, not because I can use the Bitcoin for the payment. The crypto can be used for the payment, but if I have an advantage to pay with the crypto and not with the fiat. And there is a lot of projects, also our project, that give a discount or give an advantage to pay with the crypto respect with the fiat currency. But I had to have an advantage to pay with the token. And in this case, the value is not important because the merchant accepts my token as is, and he can change immediately in euro if you want or if you don't want. But the user has an advantage. I don't have advantage to pay with the Bitcoin, but I have an advantage to invest in the Bitcoin because it is an asset with some characteristic that will increase the price in the future, and so I invest in it. But it's an investment, and the Bitcoin will become, from my point of view, any day more used as in crypto asset, not cryptocurrency. Unfortunately, it was named cryptocurrency at the beginning, but this is my point of view. And in reality, are crypto assets. Are assets that has inside some characteristics that provide me an advantage to use. I have directly my wallet. I can have a discount. I can change with another asset. I can receive very usually from a supermarket as a discount. Blah, blah, blah. There is a lot of advantage that we can use using the crypto, not using the fiat currency. This is my point.
Interesting, thank you. Ali, do you think Bitcoin is currency or an asset?
Actually, I agree with Daniele. We should redefine mass adoption first. What's mass adoption? Mass adoption, if you think about gold. Is the gold mass adoption means that you go to a coffee shop and give a piece of gold to somebody and take a coffee, as Daniel said? No. We should divide. The cryptocurrency is a very bad word. We should change it. It's not cryptocurrency. You see, these are three classes of assets. Crypto assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum, they are like gold. Cryptocurrencies like a lot of stable coins that they're emerging. And stock market, ICOs and security tokens is another thing. These are three different things. So, Bitcoin as crypto asset is infrastructure, and mass adopting in this area, it doesn't mean that anybody goes and pay Bitcoin for daily usage. So mass adoption will happen when a lot of big governments gradually adopting that and use that value for back other stable coins, other things. So, when I don't define mass adoption that anybody have Bitcoin wallet. I don't mention it as an adoption. I think mass adoption is very near, and it's about infrastructure, not daily use.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for this distinction. So my next question is, do you also see more value as a store of value within this first type of cryptos? Or there is other thoughts, I don't know, if we discuss a stable coin as Libra, for example, could it become a store of value, in your opinion?
So I actually take some issue with your classification because I think you're missing a huge piece of it, which is commodities. Most crypto anythings end up looking a lot like consumable commodities, right? Something like Ethereum really is not about store of value, and it's not about paying people. It's largely about being able to run certain types of computational processes and build something on top of it. And in a large respect, it ends up looking a lot like a consumable commodity. And it becomes a primary input in someone's business, whether that business is, file storage or anything we're building is sort of payments processing networks, any of the sort of ICOs that you mentioned, any of the, something like a security token, a lot of that is being built on this infrastructure, and it does consume some sort of base commodity, and that could be something like Tezos, that could be something like Ethereum. And I think that those behave largely in a very different way, and mass adoption and usability of those kinds of platforms really has to do with what you've built on top of it. What is it a primary input to create, and what is demand for that? Much in the same way you would think about the value of steel is largely based on the value of what people are trying to build out of that steel at any point in time. And right, the value of the tanker that you build out of that steel is sort of the corollary to whatever you've built on top of the Ethereum network. And I think that's, to some degree, a completely different set of values and a completely different way of valuing or using those assets. And those, to me, read more like commodities. And I think that's an important distinction, because when you talk about, leaving aside the ICOs and leaving aside the security tokens, which I completely agree are a separate thing, leaving aside stable coins, which are largely just digital representation, much in the same way those 0 and 1s make up your traditional bank account, I think even within that asset category, there are multiple different ways in which you can look at crypto assets as whether or not they are actual assets stored value based, or whether they are actually more of a commodity. And I think the commodities need to be treated a little bit separately when you think about things like store of value, because absolutely you can buy and store oil as store of value, but it has a very different set of connotations than buying and storing something like gold.
Daniele, will you agree?
Yes. I believe that we are like the modem in 94, 96. believe that most of the people of the audience remember how difficult it was to connect to the internet in that era. No? You have the modem, you have to have a filter to connect the line, you have to program, no? And the modem has to enter the internet, and it's very slow. And you have very few content inside.
And then the phone calls and everything
yes,
to that.
yes, exactly. Today we have in our smartphone, no? It's only 25 years no? from the beginning. And in 2007 arrived Steve Jobs with the iPhone and completely changed our way of connect to the world. No? And there was an invasion of app for there was an app for everything. No? It was a slogan that in that years. So I believe that now the crypto industry that is an industry really, because there is a lot of people that work, that earn money, that produce something. So it's not a simple, as someone say, is a Ponzi scheme. No, it's not a Ponzi scheme because there is a complete an industry behind that. Ethereum create an environment that is amazing. If you understand the potential of the smart contract, you cannot think that is a Ponzi scheme. This is a real industry that are growing, like robotics, like artificial intelligence, like investment, like other kind of industry that we are. But we can, the potential of this industry right now, because we are connected with a modem. We don't use in the mobile phone. But in 5 years from now, or 10 years, I don't know, we will be invaded by the token in the mobile phone, just like the app. We have a token for everything. No? We have to think about that. And we completely change our way we connect with our mind, with our asset, with our value. Because the property of our house will be in the wallet, the property of our car will be in the wallet. You know? So it will be completely different. So it's difficult to understand, but if we think about the future, for me it's clear what will happen, and for me it's clear that crypto will change drastically our way of life. And if there is something that will change drastically our way of life, we are in the financial conference, so we have to invest it. If we don't invest it, it's like the people that, I'm the first one, that they don't invest in Amazon after that Amazon dropped the 95% in 2001. I know Amazon at that time. I don't invest in Amazon because I don't understand the potential of Amazon. After 15 years, I understand the potential of Amazon, but I lose the 32,000% of increase of the value of Amazon in the price. So, if we take some minutes, read my book, of course, and understand the potential of the crypto, don't invest in crypto asset, a small portion of my and the client's money, I think that is too. Sorry, but
this is very important because I was arguing with some asset managers, and they told me, okay, we should be careful about our customers, and 5%, 8% performance is okay, and nothing else. It's very risky and other things. I told him, yes, you should be very careful about your customers. Not only about performance, but also about purchasing power of the money you have in your hand. If you see that the value, the purchasing power of fiat money is going down, and there's another thing out there that you can invest there, and you can use it to increase the purchasing power of your customers. That's important. Not increasing only the value of fiat monies, the number of fiat monies. So I think as an asset manager and futurist, I say this: we should be careful about purchasing power of anything, not only about our performance in increasing that thing.
Interesting. Okay, so what are the risks of investing in crypto now? And what would be the steps that we, as people who are involved in the industry, should enable to avoid these risks? Not only for us, but also for our customers, for people who are not yet acquainted with the value of crypto.
So I think there are a couple of different reasons here. I think one, it's sort of to respond to your point about purchasing power. I think it's important to remember that crypto is largely still in nascent stages. It's still developing as an infrastructure play. And what does mass adoption look like? There's still a ramp there, and there's still growth there to be had. And so to some degree, at least the way we think about it within portfolios, it's more similar to something like venture capital, except it happens to be liquid, much more transparent, and usable to buy stuff. And so in that respect, it adds that sort of long-term growth element, but it does have that kind of profile, right? These are volatile assets, and so that is part of the decision-making. But I think the other part that has been problematic for asset managers in particular is that crypto has a tendency to spend a lot of time talking about things like wallet infrastructure. Like, what does your wallet look like? How are you custodying things? Where are you custodying things? How do you protect your private keys? And all of that is incredibly important if you happen to be a practitioner and spend a lot of time thinking about crypto. However, when you go around asking asset managers about that, it's sort of like asking oil traders where their oil tanker is. Or if you're trading grain futures, how your grain silo is structured. There's the classic joke of the hedge fund manager who, makes a mistake with his futures positions and ends up with an oil tanker being delivered at their offices. That's sort of what crypto is expecting people to do, and that's unrealistic. For most people who, especially people who are in asset management, especially people that are looking at these investments not as usable things, but as store of value or as an investment product, securitization is incredibly important. And whether that looks like a private fund or it looks like our products which are exchange traded, I think that's an incredibly important piece, because ultimately I think it's unrealistic to expect everybody to be willing, able, and quite frankly have the resources or the inclination to maintain their own infrastructure that's completely redundant to traditional infrastructure. I was talking with one of the big crypto traders a couple months ago, and this guy came out of a derivatives background. He was telling me that for him, actual clearing and settlement of crypto trading is one of the most intermediated things he's ever had to trade, especially on an OTC basis. It's because it requires an enormous amount of specialized infrastructure, and I think that's one of the big pieces when you think about how do you help people enter this space from a practitioner standpoint, to some degree it needs to be easier, and it needs to be less redundant infrastructure and more well integrated with the things we all deal with, instead of expecting people to get really smart and able to run their own infrastructure from the get-go. And maybe eventually we do look at that, and I think from my perspective I see convergence between traditional securities infrastructure and blockchain-based infrastructure. I don't think 10 years from now those two things are different any more than we now think about digital trading as being different than a stock certificate. But I don't think we're quite there yet, and I think in the interim, some form of securitization and some form of packaging is an important part of adoption.
So, is really the risk to invest in crypto asset? Of course, 90% of volatility may scare to anyone, not everyone. But But I usually make this kind of metaphor. I'm Italian, so I don't care how calories has 100 gram of pepper. If I use very few pepper in the spaghetti with the vongole, no? Yes. So it's not very important how much calories has 100 gram of pasta with some vongole and a small portion of pepper. But the pepper makes the chili in the spaghetti, so the taste of the spaghetti. And in this environment now, the spaghetti has negative calories. So it's a very huge problem. More spaghetti I eat, more I lost weight. So I will disappear in the future because I have negative calories. No, it's a joke, but it's the reality. Now we are living in the world of negative rates. And if the people think that the negative rates will continue forever, we have a problem because we cannot invest in bond because we lose few months any days, no? Few money any days, no? But if we think that the world will change and return in positive rates, we have a double problem because we don't earn now and we lose money for the depreciation of the price for the next 3 years. So we have a huge problem. No? So the problem is not if we have to invest or not, is how much we have to invest. And that depends on the risk of the clients, of course. And we demonstrate, and in the book, of course, sorry for the promotion, we can demonstrate easily that thanks to the zero correlation of the crypto asset with the other asset class, that if we insert the 2% of investment in crypto, not a fund, is ETF, my fund, his fund, crypto asset, in the asset allocation, we don't change the volatility of the portfolio, of a prudent portfolio. If we invest the 5% in a balanced portfolio, we don't change the volatility and change the risk of the portfolio. And if we understand that if we invest our money in bond future, in 3 years we lose the 2% of, more or less, 2% of the investment plus the cost, that is higher than the loss of the bond. Which kind of perspective we can provide to our client? We have to find a solution, okay? Leave the money in cash and invest 2% in crypto. If the crypto will disappear, you have the same performance of the bond. No? Yes, it's true. But if the crypto will make a huge performance in the next 3 years, you have a good performance that you have habits. The 6%, 8%, not the 60% because you invest the 2% of the portfolio. But you have a positive return. So you have to consider that the crypto now is an asset class that is very important to have with a small, very small portion in the portfolio of the clients. Instead, you have a huge problem in the future.
Interesting. Okay, so infrastructure, little pepper. What else?
Okay, actually we are specialists about risk and managing risk of cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is very risky. I lose more than 100 Bitcoin in exchanges. I admit that. But I put only, in cryptocurrency, in normal traditional area, you say don't put all your eggs in one basket. But here you should say don't put all of your eggs in one type of basket. You should also change type of your baskets. Very, you should think about this. There is 4 main risks. volatility risk, exchange and storage risk, legal risk and regulations, and liquidity. There are risks that, for example, I lose a lot of money in GOX, in Cryptsy, in MintPal. So it is a place for change, not storing value. You should use custodians. You should, and not one custodian. You should diversify your custodian. A lot of custodians you should use. So please pay attention to this big thing. About volatility, Daniele said, you can, by putting a small amount of your asset under management in cryptocurrency, you can manage the risk. If you lose a little bit, and if you win, you will have a lot of profit in your basket. About legal, fortunately in Switzerland we have less legal problem because the government is very supporting cryptocurrencies. But if you manage cryptocurrency and you are mass asset manager in international area, you should be careful about regulations in every place. And liquidity. When you have a lot of, we had that problem at our basket when we want to exit at 18,000. Okay, our money asset under management was huge and we couldn't exit very easily. But we developed a lot of network of OTCs, and via them we could liquidate the money. So you should be considered. If you manage risk, it is very profitable area. But if you don't control risk, it is very dangerous.
I would argue, though, of those 4 risks, 2 of them are true of basically everything. Everything you invest in, no matter what country, no matter what it is you're investing in, they always have volatility and liquidity risk. And I think generally, asset managers broadly can get comfortable with that and know how to manage for that, right? At the end of the day, understanding the liquidity of your portfolio and understanding how likely it is to be volatile and understanding how to get out of positions when you want to is the business, I think, all of us are in ultimately. And I think those 2 risks are things that are much more in the same area as price risk and much more traditional in some respect and true of basically everything. I think the other 2 is where you run into more problems. Storage risk is a huge issue, and it involves an incredibly specialized body of knowledge around how does cold storage work? How are you going to set up your wallets? By the way, not only should you diversify custodians and exchanges, you should diversify wallets at a custodian. You should not have one wallet for a product or for a fund. You should have several. How do you manage that? How do you deal with that? Who are the best providers? How do you diligence their tech stack? It's a completely different way of doing things than traditionally what you would do, which is saying, hey, how do I feel about Goldman Sachs' balance sheet today? And do I feel good about them custodying my assets versus do I feel better about Bank of America or BNY? And I think that's a huge issue for people entering the crypto space. And I think the other one around the legality is also an issue. It's one of the reasons why, when we started this conversation, we talked about securitization. Securitizing these assets or putting them in a fund or putting them in something that has a much more clear-cut legal definition makes it a lot easier to hold. And so in large respect, packaged products in some capacity can eliminate both of those, where you're basically saying, okay, on the legal side, you're able to buy this because either it's a participation in a fund or it's an ETP or it is what it is, and you can hold that as part of your allocation, and the legal definition of those things is very well understood. And you also are basically outsourcing the need to deal with storage. And I think once you sort of deal with those 2 risks, the other risks associated with crypto assets, while yes, they're volatile, and yes, some of them can be liquidity constrained, those are things I think we as an industry are much more used to dealing with outside of crypto.
I have a solution for that. We have created an alternative investment fund just to solve all this issue and don't provide this kind of issue for the asset management to the client, because it's very problematic and risky to invite the client to purchase directly the crypto assets. it's better to insert a small portion of a fully regulated, approved in Switzerland fund that I can purchase through my banks and deposit in the banks simply, and the fund invest in crypto assets. So I can take the exposure to the crypto without taking all this risky, that is real risk. I believe also your ETF.
Solve the problem?
Of how you're able to hold these things? I mean, yes, probably wouldn't bother doing it. From our perspective, the reason we built our products, it's actually a very personal story. They were largely built for my parents and my co-founders' parents because they were trying to make allocations to crypto. It's really hard to source liquidity. At the time, there were basically no high-quality packaged products that were readily available. And how do you help somebody make that kind of investment in a way that, my mom is going to feel good about? And that was a really challenging thing to do, even just a couple of years ago. And so from our perspective, we wanted liquid products because these can be volatile and people do want ability. And that's how we set out to build our exchange-traded products, was largely so that you preserved the ability to trade volatility while not needing to take on the legal or the storage risks associated with these products, because ultimately those are things that people do have a hard time getting their heads around. And it was a huge issue for my co-founder's family, an issue I couldn't figure out how to explain that to my mom, and she wanted to make an allocation. So how do you think about that? And that's largely how we ended up building our products, was on the basis of saying, well, we understand what the risks of crypto are, we believe in its future, but how do you responsibly help somebody enter the space without needing to have such a wide range of technical expertise? And this was a way to do it, and it does let you hold your assets in the same place. It's going to show up on your UBS bank statement instead of having to say, well, okay, I'm also going to have a Coinbase account, and I'm also going to have completely separate reporting, and how do you deal with the taxes with that, and how do you deal with all of the sort of follow-on issues that come out of making that kind of investment directly?
It's a very important point that about asset managers when they enter a new area. As my experience, anybody is new adapted in this area has a lot of faults. So it's one good recommendation that use the experts about in this area. Also, Ficas has some products that our product is specialized about managing the risk.
Well, thank you very much. My last maybe question, conclusive of all the discussion. I think that we agreed upon the fact that crypto is a store of value now or potentially. As actors of the space, what concrete steps should we carry out in order to make this value always more increasing, more valuable, sorry for tautology, interacting with our investments, interacting with the customers who invest into crypto? How should we handle all these risks being actors of the space?
So you're saying, how do you mitigate some of these risks, and how does value accrue in the industry as a result of that?
Personally, you as a person who is involved into the sector, what would be your steps within the following, let's say, months, years, in order to make crypto more adopted and make crypto less risky and make crypto more valuable as a store?
So I think the framework of those 4 risks is actually, I think, a very useful one. I think what we can do as actors in the space is continue to help people understand those risks and understand how to best interact in the sector while limiting them to the greatest extent possible. I think making crypto broadly more available and more easily accessible is a huge part of that. And whether that's through packaged products, whether that's through better infrastructure, and or just purely, let's call it integration and sort of fostering interoperability with traditional infrastructure. I think those are really the steps we can take to continue to drive forward the industry.
Thank you, Fale.
I
Daniele?
mean, from the industry or from the people that have to invest?
well, the industry, and you're also a person who invests. So, like you, from inside, which steps would you take in order to bring closer all that we discussed just now?
I believe that we in this moment we are like in 2001 in the new economy post-bubble, no? And we need to clear a lot of the technical name scam that was issued in the first year of the bubble. There was more than 2,000 ICO realized, but there was more than 11,000 or people that tried to realize this ICO and was not able to do that. And probably there is also a lot of ICO that was issued without no one known and so on in China and so on. And most of them, unfortunately, are. But I believe that most of them are start-uppers that try to promote their ideas and was not able to promote that, like the normal startup that in the real economy, no? And the percentage of startup that survive is less than 10%, and I believe that will be also in the crypto space. And so in this moment there is a natural cleaning of the situation where we live. And we'll survive the crypto and the project that really create value, that really create product, that really create some advantage for the investor or for the people that will use the crypto. From my point of view, I spent my time talking with the people, making meeting events like that, others, and like the one that we organize every year in Venice, to educate the people.
You also wrote the book.
Huh?
You also wrote the book.
I make a lot of innovation in finance, and I understood that some of that has not was not like a project. Someone yes, and I understood that if you make innovation, first of all you have to educate the people, because if you provide something new, the people don't understand, the people don't know that you do that because it's new. No? So you have to invest a lot of money, a lot of time to make the people more educated about this. So the industry, all the crypto industry, everyone is moving for increase the number of people that use the crypto, the wallet, and so on. So the number of the increase of the wallet are clearly explain us that this industry has an exponential growth, and we have to continue to do that. And I believe that in few years we will be probably the 3 or 4% of the population around the world that use the cryptocurrency. Now we are less than 1%. So, and this is a good news, because that means that thanks to the scarcity, thanks to the communities that are growing, the problem with a high probability the price will go up.
Thank you for the optimism. Ali, your final thoughts?
I think we should be very honest with investors. We should tell about all aspects of cryptocurrency, from risk, from profits. And as Daniel said, education is very important, especially for asset managers. Asset managers should be educated about this new area. Also, we have, because Ficas is the abbreviation of Financial and Crypto Advisory of Switzerland. Also, we advise asset managers about establish their own part about cryptocurrency, and anything, any information you can spread about the risk, the profits, the future. It will be helpful to promoting this area.
Thank you very much for this insightful discussion. Thank you very much for being with us, and I think that there is a very interesting keynote speech now, so let's go know more about crypto. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cornelia was great. She was the only one that I understood.